So we talked about transport in the last few lectures. Oh, my lights are off. Let me turn my lights on. You can see me better. So we talked about transport in a few of the last lectures, and we looked at pumps like this pump here, this proton pump, like we see in mitochondria that pumps hydrogen ions. We looked at passive transport like diffusion, simple diffusion and facilitated diffusion, active transport. There's another kind of transport where things are brought in bulk, meaning in massive quantities. And there are two basic types, endocytosis and exocytosis. This is the transport of large items or large quantities of items into a cell. And this looks like here, let me just draw what this looks like. Here's a cell, okay? And here's, I'm going to just use all red here. Oh, I hate this. There's a cell and there's a piece of food, okay? So what happens is the cell actually pinches in around the food and brings it in. And that cell engulfs that piece of food and it surrounds it in what we call a food vacuole, which is like a transport vesicle. Okay. Some energy will be required for this because we have to transport that food vacuole and fuse it with a lysosome to digest the contents. Now, exocytosis is the opposite. This is when a cell removes large quantities of a substance from the cell. In this case, transport vesicles will fuse with the plasma membrane and contents will be released to the outside world. So it's the opposite of endocytosis, where you have a cell and here's a membrane, and the cell membrane, and here's a transport vesicle. The vesicle fuses with the membrane, you know, boop, and the contents are expelled to the outside. So endocytosis can be divided up into a couple of forms. One type is known as phagocytosis. This is cell eating. This is when cells bring in a large item to eat. And then it later fuses the food vacuole. I say a vesicle here, it's technically a food vacuole like I wrote earlier, and fuses it with a lysosome. Pinocytosis is when a cell brings in liquid and whatever is dissolved in that liquid and brings it into the cell. And lastly, receptor-mediated endocytosis sounds complicated, but it involves a ligand. And a ligand, once again, I think I've used this word before, a ligand is a molecule that binds with another molecule. It sticks to another molecule. So a ligand is a molecule that sticks to a receptor. So a ligand is what the cell wants. So the ligand binds to the receptor in the membrane, and that causes the cell to turn on endocytosis. So up here, this kind of endocytosis and this one are sort of generalized. But receptor-mediated endocytosis means there are receptors in the cell membrane. So like this, boop, here's some of these receptors, right? And maybe this is the ligand that binds to it. And the cell wants whatever this is. And so this is a very specific kind of endocytosis triggered by this very specific molecule when it binds to those receptors. And so what we can see here, here's a drawing of endocytosis. So just a big piece of food being brought in, the cell is engulfing it, its cell membrane is oozing out around that food particle, and then it's going to be brought in, and that cell membrane will pinch off around this piece of food, forming a food vacuole. Later on, a lysosome might fuse to this vacuole and digest the contents. Pinocytosis takes place when, once again, lots of liquid with dissolved substances is just pinched off and brought into the cell. And lastly, receptor-mediated endocytosis takes place when there is some kind of ligand or substance here, like these triangles, that bind to these receptors and cause a vesicle to form and pinch off containing that substance. And some of these vesicles are going to be coated. They have proteins on the outside. This is one way that a cell can label vesicles with a label so that it kind of knows where to take it or what's inside. But these are the major kinds of endocytosis. And exocytosis would look a lot like this, only backwards. So just to remind you, the binding of ligands to receptors triggers the formation of a vesicle. That's what happens in receptor-mediated endocytosis. And a ligand is a molecule that binds to a specific receptor. So if this is the receptor, this thing is the ligand, and it binds to the receptor and triggers endocytosis to take place. That's what receptor-mediated endocytosis is. That's why it's so specific, because it's triggered by only one kind of molecule, the kind that binds to that receptor. Here's an example of this in real life. Some of us have, like, I guess those of us who are normal. I'm not normal. I'm over here somewhere, or maybe over here. I don't know. But most people have these receptors in their cell membrane that can bind to LDL. That's a type of cholesterol, right? And when they bind to the LDL, they actually bring it in through endocytosis, and they get it out of your bloodstream. Now, some of us have genes, so we have a genotype that leads to this phenotype here, where we have very few of those receptors. And in that case, we bring in cholesterol. We bring them in, but we don't bring as much in as someone that has more receptors. So we have a mild form of this disease, which causes lipids to build up in our arteries, and we end up having high blood levels of LDL, and it eventually leads to heart disease. And some of us have none of those proteins, so our blood vessels really build up with that with those lipids, and we have severe problems. So there's an example of hypercholesterol. Like if you have high blood cholesterol, this is one of the reasons for it. It might not just be your diet, it might be the proteins you have in your cell membrane not allowing cells to bring in enough cholesterol to get it out of your blood. All right, so that is the end of the part on cell transport, so bringing things in and getting things out. The next lecture video then will be on how cells talk to each other, how they communicate, allowing us to be multicellular organisms. We're not really going to focus on the nervous system here, but more on like hormonal type signaling, and we'll talk about that next time.